There are mysteries that fade with time, buried under decades of dust and indifference. And then there are mysteries that refuse to die, ones that burrow so deep into the American consciousness that they become legend. The D.B. Cooper case is that kind of mystery. For 54 years, it haunted federal agents, captivated amateur sleuths, and inspired everything from Hollywood films to Halloween costumes. A man boards a plane, hijacks it mid-flight, collects a ransom, jumps into a stormy sky, and simply disappears. No body, no parachute, no name, just a ghost with $200,000 and a one-way ticket into the unknown. But ghosts, it turns out, leave traces, and after more than half a century of silence, those traces have finally led investigators, not the FBI, but a determined retired airline pilot with a YouTube channel and an obsession he couldn't shake, to a name, a real name, a face behind the legend. And the truth, as it so often does, turned out to be stranger, more human, and more heartbreaking than anyone could have imagined. It was the evening of November 24th, 1971, Thanksgiving Eve. Portland International Airport was packed with families heading home for the holiday. Among the crowd was a man who blended in perfectly: dark suit, clip-on tie, dark sunglasses, and a plain briefcase. He bought a one-way ticket under the name Dan Cooper for Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305, a short 30-minute hop to Seattle. He sat down, ordered a bourbon and soda, and waited. What happened next has been retold so many times at Borders on folklore. Midway through the flight, the man quietly handed a note to flight attendant Florence Schaffner. She slipped it into her pocket, assuming it was a phone number from a lonely passenger. The man leaned over and told her, calmly and without raising his voice, that she ought to read it. The note informed her that he had a bomb in his briefcase and that she needed to sit beside him immediately. When she did, he opened the case just enough for her to see what appeared to be red cylinders, wiring, and a battery pack. His demands were specific and deliberate. $200,000 in unmarked $20 bills for parachutes, 2 primary, 2 reserve, and a fueled aircraft ready to take him south toward Mexico. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't erratic. He was, by every witness account, composed, polite, even almost eerily so. He thanked the flight attendants. He paid for his drink. While the pilots radioed ahead and the FBI scrambled on the ground, the man in seat 18C sat quietly, sipping his bourbon and watching the clouds go by. Seattle authorities complied. The passengers were released safely. The money and parachutes were delivered. And then, somewhere over the dense, dark forests of southwestern Washington, with the aircraft flying low and a storm raging outside, the man who called himself Dan Cooper lowered the rear staircase of the Boeing 727, a feature unique to that aircraft model, and jumped into the black sky. He left behind only one thing: his clip-on tie, which had slipped off before he leaped. Just like that, he was gone. The FBI launched one of the most extensive manhunts in American history. Hundreds of agents, military paratroopers, bloodhounds, helicopters sweeping the treelines of the Pacific Northwest for weeks. They found nothing. Not a footprint, not a shred of fabric, not a single dollar bill, not for years anyway. And somewhere along the way, a media mix-up transformed Dan Cooper into D.B. Cooper, a name that would echo through American culture for generations. The FBI officially kept the case open for 45 years, investigating over 1,000 suspects before quietly shelving it in 2016 as one of the greatest unsolved crimes in the nation's history. For 9 years after the hijacking, the case produced almost nothing of value. Then, in 1980, an 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram was on a camping trip with his family along the banks of the Columbia River. While digging the sand, he unearthed something odd: 3 decaying packets of $20 bills, sun-bleached and partially decomposed, still bound together with rubber bands. When investigators checked the serial numbers, they matched perfectly with the ransom money handed to Cooper on that November night in 1971. It was the only physical evidence Cooper ever left behind, and it raised more questions than it answered. Had he died on impact and the money washed downstream over the years? Had he planted the bills deliberately as a red herring? The discovery sent investigators back into the forests and rivers of Washington with renewed energy, diverse forensic teams, new search grids. Still nothing. No body, no parachute, no gear. The money in the sand remained a tantalizing footnote with no chapter to follow it. By the time the FBI officially closed the case in 2016, most serious investigators had moved on. But not Dan Grider. A retired commercial airline captain with over 24,000 flight hours logged across a decades-long career, Grider had developed a side presence on YouTube where he discussed aviation topics for enthusiasts. When he turned his attention to the D.B. Cooper case, it wasn't for clicks or controversy. It was because something about the case genuinely nagged at him, the kind of professional instinct that doesn't switch off just because an official bureau says it's done. Grider spent years doing what the FBI had done, but with fresh eyes and modern tools. He studied declassified FBI files, reconstructed the jump trajectory using updated wind and terrain data, analyzed parachute models available in 1971, and cross-referenced everything with flight logs and topographical maps of the Pacific Northwest. He wasn't looking to become famous. He was looking for the one thread that, when pulled, would unravel the whole tapestry. That thread led him to a name that had circulated in Cooper circles for decades without ever gaining serious traction: Richard Floyd McCoy, Jr. On the surface, Richard McCoy seemed like the kind of man small-town America produced with quiet pride. Born and raised in Utah, he was a decorated Vietnam War veteran, a trained helicopter pilot, a devout Mormon, a husband, a father of two, and at the time of his arrest, a law student at Brigham Young University. His neighbors described him as reserved, courteous, and deeply religious. He coached his kids' sports teams. He went to church on Sundays. And then, 5 months after D.B. Cooper vanished into the Washington wilderness, McCoy boarded United Airlines Flight 855 in Denver and handed a flight attendant a note demanding $500,000 in cash for parachutes and a refueled plane. He wore a business suit. He was calm and polite throughout. He collected his ransom, ordered the pilots to take off again, and somewhere over the Utah desert, parachuted out the rear staircase of a Boeing 727, the same aircraft type, the same exit method, the same operational calmness as the man from 5 months prior. The FBI caught McCoy quickly this time. He left fingerprints on a water glass and handwriting on a note in the cockpit, rookie mistakes that a man of his intelligence should have avoided. He was arrested at his home in Provo, Utah, sentenced to 45 years in prison, but escaped from a Pennsylvania federal penitentiary in 1974. 3 months later, he was tracked down and killed in a confrontation with FBI agents during a shootout. Investigators at the time did consider whether McCoy and Cooper were the same man. The similarities were extraordinary: same aircraft type, same rear staircase jump, same calm demeanor, same note-passing tactic. But the FBI dismissed the theory, pointing to witness descriptions that didn't align. Cooper had been described as a man in his mid-40s with olive skin and dark features. McCoy was 29, fair-skinned, and clean-cut. The handwriting in both notes differed. The FBI labeled McCoy a copycat and moved on. But Dan Grider wasn't so sure. In 2023, following a hunch and a lead that most investigators would have dismissed, Grider tracked down a storage unit in Utah. It had connections to McCoy's family, distant but traceable. Inside, buried beneath boxes of old books and memorabilia, he found a parachute rig. Not a casual skydiving chute. A military-style rig with specific, unusual modifications, reinforced harness clips, custom cord loops that matched details buried in FBI reports from 1971. Details that had never been made public. For Grider, it was an electric moment. If this parachute was the one Cooper used, and it had come from McCoy's orbit, then the copycat theory collapsed entirely. This wasn't a man who imitated Cooper. This was Cooper. Grider reached out to the FBI with his findings. He published his research in a series of videos that quickly went viral, forcing the Bureau to respond. Agents retrieved the parachute and shipped it to the forensic laboratories at Quantico. Investigators also revisited the clip-on tie Cooper had left behind on the plane in 1971, a piece of evidence that had yielded only partial DNA in previous analyses. The plan was to compare any genetic material from the parachute and tie against DNA samples from McCoy's biological children, Shantae and Rick McCoy III. If the sequences matched, 5 decades of mystery would have their answer. For most of their lives, Shantae and Rick McCoy III had quietly deflected the rumors. Their father was a complicated figure, a war hero and a criminal, a devoted family man and a skyjacker, and they had spent decades trying to live outside his shadow. When Greider began reaching out to them, they didn't respond at first, not out of hostility, but out of a deeply personal reluctance to open something that had been sealed for half a century. Their mother had only recently passed away, and with her gone, the last reason for certain silences had dissolved. Eventually, after weeks of calls and messages, Greider found the right words. He wasn't coming to accuse anyone. He wasn't there for a sensational headline. He simply told them what he had found, what the evidence suggested, and that the story was going to come out regardless. They could either be part of the truth or outside it. Rick McCoy III agreed to speak, and when he did, the weight of everything he said was unmistakable. "We never wanted to believe it," Rick said, his voice unsteady. "But the more we looked at everything, it's all there. He was Cooper. He had to be. Yeah, we always kind of knew it was him." He explained that their hesitation to come forward had largely been about protecting their mother, who had carried the burden of that secret for decades. With her gone, the silence no longer served anyone. The confession of Richard McCoy's own children, combined with the parachute, the forensic comparisons, and the extraordinary operational similarities between the 2 hijackings, has shifted the consensus dramatically. For many investigators, researchers, and aviation historians, the D.B. Cooper case is effectively solved. The man who boarded Flight 305 as Dan Cooper on Thanksgiving Eve 1971, who collected $200,000, jumped into a Pacific Northwest storm, and became an American myth, was Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. of Provo, Utah. What drove him to it remains a matter of interpretation. McCoy returned from Vietnam decorated but fractured, as so many of that generation did. He was educated and capable, but financially strained. Some psychologists who have studied the case suggest the hijacking wasn't purely about money, that it was an act of reclamation, a man seizing control in a world where he felt powerless. The elaborate disguise for the Cooper hijacking, aging himself up, darkening his appearance, constructing a persona, and the more careless execution of the McCoy hijacking 5 months later may reflect the psychology of someone who, having pulled it off once, grew overconfident and reckless. McCoy never confessed. He died in a gunfight with federal agents at 30 years old, taking whatever he knew to the grave. But the silence of his family, the parachute hidden in a Utah closet, the DNA samples now being analyzed at Quantico, and the word of his own son have begun to fill the space that silence left behind. There is something both satisfying and melancholy about the resolution of a mystery this old. For 54 years, D.B. Cooper was more than a criminal, he was a symbol. In the disillusionment of post-Vietnam America, he represented something people quietly rooted for. The little guy outrunning the system, disappearing into the wilderness on his own terms. The legend sustained itself precisely because it had no ending. Now it does. The ending isn't cinematic. It's human. A young veteran, pulled apart by financial pressure and the psychological weight of a war that chewed men up and rarely apologized for it, put on a suit, bought a plane ticket, and tried to take back something he felt the world owed him. He got away with it once. The second time, the cracks showed, and the life he returned to, the wife, the children, the law school classes, couldn't contain what he had done or who he had become. Dan Greider, the retired pilot who refused to accept that the case was closed, gave something back to the families touched by this story and to a country that had waited more than half a century for a straight answer. And Shantae and Rick McCoy III, in finally speaking the truth their family had carried in silence, gave their father something he perhaps didn't deserve but received nonetheless acknowledgement. Not absolution, just the simple, heavy acknowledgement that he was real, that he existed, and that the legend had a heartbeat all along. The name on the boarding pass was Dan Cooper, but the man behind it was Richard Floyd McCoy Jr., and after 54 years, America finally knows who jumped out of that plane.